Today in the program, some leaders within the Republican Party are jumping in on the Pride Month enthusiasm. What are they saying, and what should the response of Christian conservatives be? We'll talk about that today. It's also Father's Day weekend, and while many continue to make the argument that kids don't specifically need a father as long as they have loving adults in their life, new research once again demonstrates what everyone already really knows, that dads actually matter quite a bit. We'll talk about that as well. There is a new national holiday. You might not even know that today is a national holiday, but it is. It's called Juneteenth. Why is June 19th a day worth remembering? We'll talk about that later in the program as well with Dean Nelson. But first in the program today, this week more than 130 Republicans signed a letter that was sent to the Secretary of Veterans Affairs urging him to maintain the current law that prohibits the VA from offering abortions or abortion-related services. The effort was led by Congressman Matt Rosendale of Montana, who also helped lead the charge against the Equal Access to Contraception for Veterans Act, calling for a recorded vote on the bill Tuesday that resulted in its defeat. And he joins me now. Congressman Rosendale, welcome to Washington Watch.
Thank you so much for having me on today, Joseph. It's a real privilege.
Well, we are glad to have you, and this has been a great week for you. And, you know, the week that you've had is the reason why we want people in Washington, D.C. Even when you're in the minority, you can get a lot of things done, can't you? And I want to start off by talking about the Equal Access to Contraception for Veterans Act. A lot of words there. It's probably something most people aren't aware of. Tell me what it is and why it is that you objected and voted against it.
Joseph, I tell you, that went through the 116th Congress on a voice vote, and I was stunned to hear that the Republicans just allowed that to pass through in the 116th. And when I discovered that it was going to be brought before our Veterans Affairs Committee, I demanded a vote in committee, and because we discovered that it was not only going to provide contraception through the VA at no cost, which means it's going to be the taxpayers' cost, but that includes Plan B and similar abortifacient drugs that most of, I would think, your listeners and certainly my supporters are against using taxpayers' dollars to provide. I mean, this brings an end to a life, as I recognize it. It truly does. And so we were able to get the Republicans on the committee that did not have legislation commingled, if you will, with that to vote against it. And then as the Democrats have completely perverted the system on the floor and the process that we use, they have been asking for votes to go through on a suspension and a unanimous consent where literally legislation gets passed without members voting upon it. And that's where I went down and demanded the roll call vote. And by doing so, that's where you force it to a two-thirds majority it would require for that bill to pass. And by making the calls, talking to the other congressmen throughout the Republican caucus, we were able to get 188 of the members to vote against that legislation to defeat it.
Well, we appreciate your alertness to this issue. And I think what you described well in that this, in a microcosm, is just part of a broader debate we've been having for decades, literally, whether it's federal funding of Planned Parenthood or abortion contraceptive and Plan B in all sorts of other programs throughout the federal government. And this is just another place where that debate is taking place. Should the government force people to pay for things that they have a religious objection to? It's not an age-old debate yet, but it is an old debate now, and you have been alert to it. Now, you mentioned there's a lot of procedure in here that I don't want to get too bogged down on, but why would Congress do any vote that is just a voice vote where people aren't actually recorded in how they voted?
Okay, that is a great question, Joseph, and it's stunning. After serving in the Montana legislature, you could never pass legislation that way. U.S. Congress has granted themselves, through their rulemaking, the ability to pass legislation, and I don't mean just by the names of new post offices. I mean substantive pieces of legislation that spend billions of dollars on what they call a voice vote, and they come in on typically Monday, and they state the pieces of legislation, and then they say, without objection, this is considered passed by unanimous consent. And there could literally, I have been on the floor objecting to these, where there is one Democrat, one Republican, and that is it. And without anyone there to object to it, they literally pass those pieces of legislation by, in air quotes, unanimous consent, so that it goes on the record as being passed unanimously. And there's a lot of members who are willing to allow that to happen so that they can go back to their districts and say, I didn't vote for that piece of legislation, but yet they don't want to stand up and say, no, I voted against that because it's wrong, and the people that elected me do not want to see their tax dollars being used for this type of act.
So that's a procedure through which politicians can have their cake and eat it as well. Is that right?
That is exactly right, and it's terrible. And so myself and many of my colleagues, we've got several very strong members that have said we are not going to allow this to happen. I think that you're probably familiar with my colleague to the south in Colorado, Congresswoman Lauren Boebert. She did the exact same thing for another piece of legislation that day. It was like everyone discovered, Joseph, that day that even as the minority, we were able to defeat bad legislation, and it was an awakening. And so we were able to defeat two pieces of legislation last week.
And I want to bring this to people's attention just so they understand some of the games, because, there's a lot of there is bipartisanship in Washington, D.C., and some of the things people come across in a bipartisan way to do is to allow each other to avoid accountability to their voters. And really, this is just something where they say, hey, I don't want to say I voted for it. I don't want to say I supported it, but I also don't want to say I voted against it. So regardless of what side my constituents are on, I can phrase my response in a way that makes them think I'm on their side. And it's just a game that allows politicians to avoid accountability. And we appreciate you there making sure that people are going to be accountable, because without accountability, we're not in charge, are we, as voters?
That you are 100% accurate. And it all started back at the committee level, where they were going to allow it to pass out of committee with a voice vote. And that way, again, it gave the different members that cover, if you will, to be able to talk to whichever block of voters they wanted to and say that they were for something or against something, and they didn't really have to live with the results of it. And I said, no, we're going to have a recorded vote on this. We're going to have people get on the record. They're going to have to stake out their territory, whether they support this or whether they don't support it, and then they can go back to their voters and explain.
Well, that isn't the only thing you've been advocating for life on this week. You sent a letter to the Secretary of Veterans Affairs. Tell us about that letter and what you were trying to accomplish there.
And basically, we did that first, Joseph, because I had had Secretary McDonough in some hearings, and I asked him pointed, was he going to maintain the current laws within the department which prohibit the VA from performing abortions or providing abortion counseling? And he said that he had no intention of making any changes. But we have seen such a lurch to the radical left with this Biden agenda that there was no way that I could just take that as that's how this administration is going to handle this going forward. McDonough serves at the privilege of the president, and the president is the one who's going to be able to come in and push this legislation forward that could try to force funding, taxpayer funding for abortions or abortion counseling. So we drafted the letter. I was able to very easily get 100. You said 130, it was nearly 140. It was 137 members of Congress, Republican members of Congress, I might add, to sign on to this letter to urge Secretary McDonough to maintain those policies. And so they are on the record. There's a lot of good people that are willing to step up and take the vote.
Do you expect a response?
I don't, because he's going to have to bow to the will of the Biden administration. And as we have seen, it is a completely radical, extreme agenda. And I've got grave concerns. They literally, the Democratic Party is the party of death. They believe on abortions on demand, and it's up to the Republican Party to protect life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that's where it all begins, is right there at the conception.
Well, on that point, yesterday, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi was asked by a reporter whether a 15-week-old unborn baby is a human being. I'd like to play that clip for you and get your response.
The Supreme Court this fall will review a Mississippi law that bans most abortions after 15 weeks of pregnancy. Is an unborn baby at 15 weeks a human being?
Let me just say that I am a big supporter of Roe v. Wade. I am a mother of 5 children in 6 years. I think I have some standing on this issue as to respecting a woman's right to choose.
Well, what do you make of the Speaker's response there to the question of whether a 15-week-old unborn baby is a human being?
It's just stunning and frightening. For the party that proclaims their belief in science, anyone knows that at 15 weeks we certainly can show that a fetus, a baby, has separate and unique DNA. And that's exactly why we needed to send that letter to Secretary McDonough, because when we have the Speaker of the House making statements like that, showing, as they have in the past, that they're willing to not only abort a baby up until delivery, but they are willing to withhold medical treatment from a child that has just been born. It's frightening.
Well, and it really is the science. It is a unique, unrepeatable human being. She even knows that, and she, I think, essentially admits that in her refusal to answer the question, because as somebody who is required to be enthusiastically pro-abortion, there's not a way to answer that question that is helpful to her, so she just refuses to. And Congressman Rosendale, thank you so much for your efforts on Capitol Hill this week and for joining us today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Joseph.